next poll question, which is, what are airlines' options to implement a linear human capital cost structure? And the answers are, please select one. I mean, voluntary unpaid leave, changes to pay rates, unpaid vacation, furloughs, and strategic layoff. Again, please select your answer. We have 30 seconds to put together the results. Thank you very much. And the answer should be ready in just a few seconds. And we have the answers, and people voted as the first option with 62% furlough and strategic layoff will be the first one to happen to implement those savings, followed by changes to pay rates, and followed by voluntary unpaid leave, and only with 1% unpaid vacations. Does anyone from the panel wants to comment on this one? Of my views, I can tell you that obviously airlines will be resizing themselves, and because of what Charlie and myself described at the beginning, based on the large scale reduction that needs to happen not only on the workforce but in other key areas in order to preserve cash, seems to be that furloughs. We have been seeing that in the past couple of weeks, what is happening, and layoffs. So basically, I totally agree with that assessment as well from the audience. Any other comment from the panel?
Yeah, this is Liliana. I wanted to mention that this is where the culture of the airlines would come into play big time. Every airline kind of historically has some sort of a choice that they kind of rotate towards and gravitate towards. For example, JetBlue has a no furlough policy, so they probably would go towards voluntary unpaid leaves. It's going to be interesting to see in general. We see this even in retail, that the culture is what will drive which options the airline would take to manage this.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're moving to the final poll question, which is, if a government were to invest in an airline, what guarantees should be in place? And we have as a potential answers, no dividends payoff, no executive compensation increment for a number of years, no stock buyback, oversight of operations, a seat on the board. And again, you have 30 seconds to put your answer, to select your answer. The answer is about to come. Okay, so we have with 46%, the audience choose as first option, no stock buybacks, followed by 80% no dividend payoff, followed then by a seat on the board, which could be a labor seat, and followed by no executive compensation increment for a number of years, and the last one with 10% oversight of operations. Does anyone from the panel wants to further comment on this one?
It's Charlie again. This is a really interesting, the responses are very interesting, obviously all over the map except for the no stock buyback. It's understandable why as government investors, you wouldn't want to see the company doing something which is perceived to be lining the pockets or not effective deployment of capital. But I think that to a certain degree, it seems to me that going into this, given the prominence of liquidity, working capital under the spotlight, that this has come to the fore on this, I just wonder whether or not the cash reserves tolerances of the airlines themselves is going to increase following this event. In which case, not a lot of incentive to actually do a stock buyback anyway. Keep the cash for operations.
Okay, good. I mean, this is Renee. The comment
I
that I
hear,
have on
I
this.
hear you. I just, my fear here is that there is a realistic, you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like any regulation that starts happening in any industry. There is a realistic level of caution, and then there is just bad business. And from customer experience perspective, and if you think about where the money went from airline perspective, a lot of it goes into managing of the planes, installing new technology on the planes. It's a very experience driven expense. So I just would love if we have any other regulator coming to this call later on to talk about, once we go through this, to keep this in a realistic way as well, because going too far out will definitely impact the experience later on.
And you think that the government at an oversight level, or even a seat on the board, would that compromise, do you think, the experience investment?
I mean, I can't. When I was when 2008 happened, I was managing the liquidity of Royal Bank of Canada in New York, and I went through all of the regulation that came after. So I saw how some things made sense, and others were just so much of a, you know what I mean, going the pendulum, going in the other way too much. I wish that when these decisions are made, there is also kind of like a seat that is more the customer voice, if you will, because we are still going to be a customer economy later on. And coming from the kitchen, I can tell you, it is very expensive to design even this digital world that customers are requiring from airlines these days and airports. These infrastructures are really, really expensive, and there are OPEX, like the way the world moves. Less is capital, more is operating expense these days in the technology world. So there are these kind of other considerations that drove some of the actions of the aviation in the last 10 years that is not going to go away now that this happened.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. So we're moving on with the first question for the panel. And the question is, under COVID-19 times, what are the immediate options for action available to airlines and airports? What is stopping this action from happening, if any? Who would like from the panel to take the opportunity? Okay, I'll start myself.
This is Maurice. I think if I'm understanding the question properly, immediate levels of action. And if you look at that slide that's up right now, that's a functional reality as it sits. I've gotten images from out of Doha as well as out of Charles de Gaulle. Airports closing. I would never imagine that Orly closed last week, first time since 1913. That we've seen an airport closed, and this is reality. So how are we dealing with today and looking at any level of cost containment? So for us, how well can we either defer some level of cost? If we're looking at operations and maintenance costs, whatever we can do to actually bring down some levels of numbers to work with that. And on top of that, also looking to any level of financial relief from our regulatory bodies, which is our federal government, but also looking at our FAA as well as our Florida Department of Transportation. Are there grants available? Anything else that we can do to reap in some level of financial resources to go ahead and cover some of our inherent costs that we're dealing with today? Based upon some of the numbers I presented to you, if you go back and look at that, there are two types of airports in North America. There are residual and compensatory airports. So our business model is somewhat different. But you're looking at the driving factors behind it when you look at management companies, concessionaires, and our business partners that pay rent and they pay MAGs and they pay costs for operating an airport. They're going to be looking for relief. And we need to be able to balance that as well, because the airlines are looking for the same thing. where do you find that blend? And we're trying to find that magic wand to help make that happen. And it doesn't exist right now. So there's that collaboration of just continual dialogue between airports and airlines, as well as with our other business partners. To how do we find a way to get to this level where we need to be?
Okay, very good. Thank you, Maurice. I think Charlie wants to expand on that as well.
Sure. Yeah. And looking from an airline perspective, and again, this is probably more broadly from just a general business perspective, but I think that the immediate opportunity, of course, and many are already well into this, but really deconstructing the business, digging into costs, preserving cash to free up liquidity. I mean, I think that's really what the objective is here. But by doing so, I think that the natural areas that all companies will be looking at, particularly airlines, probably 5 key ones, standard ones: labor, and there was the question on labor a moment ago. But really, is this the time for voluntary leaves and early retirements? Is it the time to suspend retirement, voluntary contributions, et cetera? So I think labor is obviously a very, very natural, very rich area for looking for cost containment in the short term, albeit at the same time, one does also have to have a vision, particularly the airline, as it takes so long to spool up again. Being very sure that the right human capital will be available at the right time. So it's a balancing act on this one, I think. The other, as Maurice said, facilities and rents. Basic questions that I'm sure airlines are asking themselves: that does that lounge need to be opened? With 90% fewer travelers through that airport, do we actually need to have our lounge? The headquarters, with remote working becoming the norm now, how does that impact long-term and short-term the facilities requirements for the corporation? The airport counter space, terminal rents, all these areas, the whole area of facilities and rents is ripe for grinding and digging into. On the aircraft front, I'm sure that every airline is looking at their portfolio, and those that have wet leases are probably looking very closely at the force majeure clauses right now. And this is something which, oftentimes these decisions are taken years before an aircraft is delivered on a new aircraft. But the question really is, do the delivery schedules that were agreed upon, do they still make sense? And of course, as we're seeing some fairly high profile announcements from certain airlines, it doesn't make sense for certain airlines. And the manufacturers are left kind of holding the bag on that and involved negotiations. On the variable cost front, I think the big, probably controllable is a cost like marketing costs. Typically for an airline, it could be anywhere between 6 and 12% of annual operating costs, depending on how they define it, as it were. But obviously, a lot of that marketing money does not need to be spent now. Yet there needs to be enough in reserve to fund recovery. But that's an area where there's immediate opportunities. I think that really what's going to be interesting here is people will be surprised at what they find. And I believe that actually is going to be the basis of some decisions that are not temporary, but are actually permanent. So a general rethink of what does the business require to be a business. And I think that through all of this, the other thing that, of course, underlines all of this is the airline's view and philosophy of the supply chain. On one hand, we're all in this together. So it's not right at this time simply to jam supply partners who've stood by. But at the same time, there do have to be creative solutions found together with supply chain partners, whether it is a deferment of payments, pushing out payments, albeit on the acceptance of materials and inventory. But these are all areas which, again, they're not, there's nothing surprising about this, but it requires a very disciplined and very rigorous approach in each one of these areas, I believe.
Good. Liliana, would you like to add anything about it?
I actually do. I'm Maurice. Sorry, Charles, you didn't leave anything. Like, we are shutting down the company. Like, you had a very thorough list there. So I guess I understand the methodical approach to all of this. I guess my question is a little more, are we talking about short term or long term? Because it's really important for us to think about people like Maurice in the value food chain, and the concession providers. And this is a whole. If we go through the list that you just listed, we're going to destroy so much value out there with the assumption that we're not going to need this. And these things to be, if we shut all of this down, to turn it back on is going to take so much time that I guess my question to the world, is that if I knew we're going to go here, I probably would have added another poll question of like, do you think that this whole industry is just going to disappear? Because before this happened, we were working towards, end-to-end experiences and getting tourism to be an amazing experience, and getting things actually much more, active in terms of that, you know what I mean, of that demand curve, if you will. The way you approach it, it feels like we're not going to need marketing. There is no world in which we don't need marketing for travel, right?
So can I just can I respond to that, Renee?
Yeah, I would love that. I mean, I think that's what we're here for. We're here to have an honest conversations about this.
So my view on this is that no, obviously I'm not advocating for the amputation of core business disciplines and processes that are required. What I think that the reality is this, though, again, not knowing when the recovery is coming, knowing this is very profound and that there is no precedent for this. And that there's a psychological trauma that's been inflicted on travelers. The traveler, as you and Liliana, you spend a lot of time thinking about the mindset of the traveler, and I think that you would agree that there are some very important unanswered questions about really what does travel look like in the new world? What's on the mind of a traveler, and what is the travel experience? What are their expectations? But all these things are going to be either pacing items or obstacles to recovery. Problem is we don't know when recovery is coming. So, I think that the prudent thing for any company that has to preserve cash is to look at how do they shrink their operations in the short term while still having access, i.e. having supply chain intact, having staff on hand, whether they're furloughed staffs or coming back or whatever. But I think it's really about accepting the reality that we have to shrink to grow again.
No, in spirit, I completely agree with you. I guess my approach is more, and again, coming from designing experiences with airports and working with IATA on different things. I think now is the moment where organizations like IATA and AAA can get together and start thinking in a collaborative way as an industry that's larger than aviation, how we can all together design a new temporary reality to preserve as much value as we can across the journey, the whole travel ribbon, not just the aviation. Because if you look at things in isolation, it's going to be such a, you know what I mean, like a war zone where everybody, like you just mentioned, is going to steal from one sector to pay the other. And it's just, I don't know if that's a sustainable change. And if it's the spirit of the aviation industry has been that whole like codependency. So my thought has been in the last few weeks that it will be amazing if the dependent industries can get together and start thinking about this as a team.
So
if I could chime in from an airport side, and Liliana, you mentioned it well within AAAE, and we're talking about IATA. I also chair the World IT Committee Steering Committee for ACI World, and they've been having a lot of discussions and dialogue with ICAO as well. So if you look at maybe those four bodies themselves, I'm sure they've been having those types of discussions as to where the industry is going, realizing one thing that intrinsically the way we look at it between airports and airlines, we look at the long term because we have to make long-term decisions to figure out what the industry is going to look like to meet airline expectations, while airlines are more agile and they have the flexibility to develop and move a little bit more quickly than we can. So therefore, it creates this difference of how we can actually collaboratively get together and move our aerospace. But if you look at the industry as it was sitting, as we were progressing going into 2020, we were averaging almost 4 billion people globally moving across our airspace. So airlines were moving passengers and cargo safely. Airports were receiving and sending people off. And we were looking at a growth factor in the next 10, 15 years to go from 4 billion to 8 billion. So what is that number going to look like now, given where we are today? Or do we peel back the onion a little bit and look at overall transport and who's actually flying? Take away the business traveler. If you go back and I think you looked at some of the numbers, I think 40 to 50% of travelers that are flying are basically first-time travelers. What have we changed their mindset that they may not want to fly anymore? Are they going to be putting themselves into planes and actually starting that process back up again? If not, you now have to look at a significant shift, no matter how much marketing or advertising or whatever it is that you put into your business profile and how your organization is expecting to operate. So yes, we need to do a little deeper dive and go back, not just airspace, but all of the individual touch points that comes along that fits part of the whole supply chain.
Okay, very good discussion. I think we all agree on I would say 5 principles. The first one is airlines needs to reduce costs, and this is done through network capacity costs. The second one, the industry and the airlines needs to enhance liquidity. There are a number of public and private funding mechanisms that they can use to that. Third, containing costs. The industry needs to really focus on containing costs, not only on a linear human capital cost structure, but as well on workforce salary cuts. Fourth, an aggressive cost containing plan needs to be in place and needs to be diligently executed. And fifth and last, cost needs to be airlines need to be watching costs and prepare themselves for a marathon, as demand will eventually pick up, but just gradually. So thank you very much for your comments. We're moving to the next question. The next question is, what has happened to the airline profits from the last 10 years? Why airlines don't have the cash reserve and the liquidity to weather these crises? Is it the same for airports? What, operationally speaking, is the structure preventing this from being the case? So go ahead, anybody that wants to take that from the panel? I can start myself.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'll add a comment to this. You know, I mean, the headlines have been how well the airlines are doing, and I cited myself. You know, looking at the EBIT numbers last year, they were averaging regionally between 3 and 9%, 3 being Europe and 9% being the U.S., which are historical highs actually on the higher end of the scale there. So, you know, there has been a lot of profit taking in the airlines. Some of that's been given back to shareholders through dividends, et cetera. Yes, there have been some buyback exercises going on as well. But I think that the issue is this: even in last year, which arguably is one of the very best years in airline history, there still is an industry-wide negative free flow of cash, around minus 2% of revenues. So going into this, you know, I think we think that airlines are cash cows, but with the capital expenditures that airlines have and new aircraft, et cetera, you know, the overall cash position never has been very good. Now, some of those are own making because they have internal cash reserve requirements that may have been not tight enough. But I know there's a lot of hand wringing, particularly in the U.S., about the airline bailout plan. Where some people are arguing, well, it's the airline's own fault, but I just don't see it. I think it's the nature of the business operations as we know them today.
My concern on this one is that the perception that the public has today about these buyback options, you know, and stock options and everything that has happened, is that there are many other high capex industries that will require government assistance. So basically, I see the airlines in a weak position or weaker position presenting this business case for financial aid, either on the private side or on the public side. And this is why I think airlines are getting so much backlash on this, because of the many years the buyback program has been instituted to basically to please investors and to inflate the stock prices. So they're in a difficult situation, and they need to very well present the case, which they are doing. You know, basically there is no liquidity. They only have 3 months of cash reserve, you know, available, and they're running out of this, and demand has basically evaporated. So that's the comment that I have on that one.
Yes.
Would you like to add, Maurice, Liliana?
Well, we don't sit and have a bucket of money sitting there to hold and spend. But from an airport perspective, a majority of the money that an airport makes goes back into an airport. So we drive the economy. So in Miami, 1 in, I think, 10 jobs is derived from our airport being functional and operational. So we're working on construction projects and a lot of capital improvement. We're about to also look at launching a new capital program as well, just to ensure that we're working on the economy continues to flow, and these improvements are expected by the carriers, and we need to do airport improvements as well. So our challenges are, we put these plans into place years ago. So if there's going to be a shift in the industry or carriers aren't going to function, then yeah, we may have to go back and look at our long-term strategic plan of where we expect our airport to be and how we support our catchment area and driving the Miami economy.
Okay, thank you very much. We're moving to the last question, which is what will be the lasting legacy of this pandemic be for the industry? How will the industry change, if it will change?
I thought a lot about this question actually when you sent it a day ago, and I would say for me, even the way people around me react to the pandemic, I see a very diverse reaction, and I really think what happens is now people perceive that the way it's, by the way, customer experience in me again bias here, but the sample usually is driven by the people around you, and you create that reality of what will happen based on who surrounds you, what conversations are around you. To me, it has been quite eye-opening to see the diversity, especially in New York, of how people really take polar views of what's happening. I'm like one night, looking at Facebook mom groups where they literally are saying they'll never travel. And then the next day I'm talking to another woman in another world that talks about revenge travel and how she's already planning her next trip, and that she wants to travel even more now. So I think it's really hard, based on what Maurice was saying as well, it's really hard to understand, are people going to be like, life is too short, I'm going to travel and see as much as I can once this is open, or if people will kind of move into that kind of fear and like, let's enjoy the simple things and go back and retract. I don't think that we have enough justifiable data right now. I think it's too soon for us to make any conclusions for the whole industry in the long run, but that's just me.
Okay, any other comments?
I'm not a prognosticator either, but having been in this industry for the time that I've been in, we want people to fly, and as long as there's a comfort feel and people want to see the world and what's available, hopefully, as long as you're putting bodies in seats, and that's moving the industry along, and you have your carriers like your Boeings and your Airbuses developing more fuel-efficient aircraft. As the industry has its individual niches that need to come together to make one strong, viable ecosystem, if any part of that is not synergized, you're going to have a long-term problem. The issue is not just my airport. I think the airports across the world have basically planned and have looked at the movement of their airports, and the growth of their airports is based upon existing empirical data that says the industry is growing, where more people are moving collaboratively. Airlines have said airports, we need to be able to grow. We need to modernize your airports to make it more efficient, right? Because we were looking at the passenger experience and how do we treat the customer and the whole 9 yards. Now, if that is going to shift, then it causes us to change our business model and our business profile. Now, what does that do for industry? What does that do for the planning for everybody in the ecosystem? And that becomes a challenge. So the future is, if we don't sit and get together collaboratively, everyone in the food chain, and have that dialogue, then God only knows when we come out of this, when we do come out of this, is it a very slow progression that goes into next year? Will it rapidly increase before the year is out and we can work to getting back to some level of normalcy? but that's going to be the challenge.
I agree. I mean, and this is Rene. I think, I'm optimistic about the industry will change, will become leaner, will have to because the economy is shrinking, more cost focused, flexible, and agile. Besides, I am expecting potential regulatory changes and key ones at airports, especially related to social distancing requirements at counters, security checkpoints, custom areas. Likewise, airlines will be having some changes as well through their boarding procedures. They are instituting right now more flexible, more seat flexible policies as well, just to name a few. In addition, as I mentioned before, I'm expecting mergers and acquisition, takeovers, and bankruptcies to happen, even renationalization of airlines as well. So hopefully they are able to weather this crisis, especially as we are entering into very difficult times. That is, the economy is shrinking, will shrink further. There are many uncontrollable variables and unknowns to forecast future looking demand. And eventually the traffic will rebound, but will rebound with a limited or even negative GDP growth, which is going to be affecting the airlines in the future as well. Okay, so thank you very much. We finished with the questions. Now we are moving to the Q&A session with the audience. So please type your questions so I can read it to the panel and you can have your answer. Looking to get the first question. Since one is just coming in right now. One of the questions arriving. Yeah, go ahead.
I can start with one question that I have here that I'm seeing, Rene.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we have one that is how can the software industry help the airlines and airports in this time? What steps should be taken by them?
I guess you might be throwing that to me since I'm the IT guy in the group. I appreciate that, Lilian. One of the things I think we actually truly need to look at is more automated systems within our airports. And we've talked about proprietary systems a lot of the carriers may maintain, and a lot of them are operating a lot of their old legacy systems as well. But if we can work towards implementing more levels of automation, you look at better cost containment, but I think it gives you better efficiencies across the board. I believe there's some collaboration that's taking place now or prior to this happening that some airlines and airports are actually working on some pilot projects together to see how they can actually simplify business processes. And we've looked at quite a few, just to name biometrics in regards to biometric entry and exit in our airports. A lot of us have been working on that, and that can simplify and help reduce costs. We looked at implementing things like digital twin and other type services, even managing efficiencies of utilities a lot better. So there's other ways of managing effective cost containment, and technology is a key indicator within all of this. And it also depends, for those of you that may be on the call, as IT directors, IT managers, CIOs, where do you sit in the organizational framework? Or do you have that seat at the table to be able to have that discussion with your senior managers, with your CEOs and your CFOs, that how you can manage costs by leveraging technology to deliver on the business needs and the requirements for the airport as well as for the airline.
Another thing I would add, Maurice, that I think that was amazing, thank you, is the couple of technology providers reached out to me as well. I would say communications, like again, automated communications is going to be looked at again, I think, across the board in terms of kind of emergency response and how do you provide information two ways, not just blasts, which is what historically we've seen even in the aviation, but rather the capability of having a two-way conversation with the public. I think that probably will be pretty popular in the next year. And I would also kind of challenge people to just be creative. I saw this article yesterday about an airline in offering to become nurses, the cabin crews that are going to be using their CPR skills to help some hospitals. And the way, let's say, I'm super busy, it's just, again, repositioning and thinking in this new environment, what can I help with, and how can I be useful to this society today? So just, I would say my short answer to your question is just be creative and think about empathetically what are the problems of the airports and airlines, and position your products and services to support that.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one question from the audience, and the question is related. So, has anybody did anybody see this crisis coming, or has this been a surprise to everyone in the aviation community? I can take initially that question myself. Obviously, this is a good question. I mean, the virus is definitely an unexpected event, but airlines need to manage all internal and external risks associated with their operations. Therefore, virus outbreaks and diseases that may affect travel behavior are a major risk to any business, and airlines should know about very well. The industry have dealt in the past with different viruses and outbreaks and contagious diseases, such as the Ebola, the H1N1, the avian flu, the Zika virus, and basically the airline has been able to cope with that. But this virus is one that the industry have not been seeing for that long time. Looking at financial statement from at least one U.S. airline, I was able to look at one of the potential external risks and business disruptions that they realized it could be impacting the business. And one of them is associated with virus and outbreaks. So they are aware of this, not to the extent that we have been seeing today, but how well prepared an airline might be to tackle this issue is another ball game. But to answer the question, yes, they knew about the risk, and definitely they were aware of it. Anybody else? Anybody from the panel would like to further comment on that one? Okay. Look at the following question.
All I'll say, guys, is when I was in the aviation industry, that every contract I looked at had 3 layers of support, and the level of support that would cover something like this was excruciatingly expensive, and I wouldn't have gotten anything done or built in the airports if I had paid that level of support for my services. So I don't know if the question is how are they prepared. We're all prepared. It's a risk. It's a business management 101, and it's a risk reward and risk return analysis when you're in the situations making these infrastructure decisions. And unfortunately, CFOs are looking at percentages, right? So this kind of like emergency response business case is really, really hard to pass. So I would say people were prepared, but financially, did we have the priority to invest and sometimes pay 2 times for something to be built, just so you have in that chance the right proper recovery processes? I don't know that was really there.
Okay, the next question that I have relate to the few, or not the so few, the cargo flights that airlines has started to put together in order to move precious cargo, medical supplies, and some other goods. So the question is, what is the percentage of total revenue that cargo flights represent today for an airline? And how adaptable are the passenger aircraft to carry cargo on passenger seats? Can anybody take that from the panel? Okay, one answer that I have to that is that yes, there are besides the few humanitarian flights, the only revenue being generated today by the airlines is through cargo flights. For cases where a carrier does not operate a dedicated cargo fleet, many airlines are converting or adapting their passenger fleet to transport medicine, supplies, and other essential goods. In fact, cargo rates has risen more than 10% in the recent weeks as a number of companies are prepared to pay more to ship goods after drastic cuts in passenger flights, and therefore is being transported today. It was transported in the past in belly cargo as a belly cargo capacity. Another positive news on this is that the oil prices have fallen, and if one combines higher cargo rates with lower fuel costs, it is definitely becoming an economical opportunity for airlines to haul cargo using their adapted passenger planes. But overall, very difficult times. I don't have an answer specifically about what percentage will represent that today, but if one looks at the total revenues that the airlines were making before this crisis, they are not even at 8% today of whatever they were making in the past. So basically, they are under a very limited revenue intakes and opportunities.
I would like to chime in real quick with just two numbers for you, just to give you an idea. And some of the numbers I shared with you earlier, when we're reflecting roughly a 68% decrease in passenger flights, we're only reflecting roughly an 11% decrease in cargo flights. So cargo is not as affected as much as passenger flights. So cargo itself is still moving. I believe carriers themselves are still flying belly cargo. And so between that as well as their cargo arms, I think they're still operational and doing as best as they can. I'm not sure if they need to consider putting cargo in seats.
Yeah, again, this is dependent on how you look, how, your overall approach to how bad and how long this is going to stay. I have a question that I just wanted to, Renee, if you don't mind, it seems like a follow through of what I spoke about, so I wanted to make sure we cover it. It says, Liliana, you spoke about regulatory oversteps in the financial industry in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, and compare it to the current environment in aviation. There are already politicians in the U.S. calling for airlines to implement a blanket full refund policy because they will be receiving public support. What are some ways that airlines can navigate a potentially disruptive regulatory environment? I would say here to this, to continue the parallel, the difference is that the 2008 hit a very rich industry, and unfortunately, the aviation industry is not that rich, which means the cloud is and the lobbying is probably not as powerful as what it was back in 2008. But still, lobbying is the way to go here. That's why I kind of keep talking about, and Maurice and I keep talking about this front that needs to be united and the voice that needs to be allowed to talk about the consequences to the public, because it's a trickle effect. If you implement some policy that will essentially destroy the industry or the public service, because airlines won't be, it's not sustainable essentially, then eventually you will hurt the public. And maybe making this connection for the politicians will at least bring that consideration when they decide what to do.
Okay, sounds good. I have another question here from the audience. I mean, can anyone in the panel forecast an estimated time frame in which we would be somewhere back to normal operations in the aviation industry? And I think Charlie already answered that one. If you want to comment on that one, Charlie.
Sure, I will. I mean, again, zero crystal ball. No one has a crystal ball on this one. But I think that when looking at the characteristics of this recovery, it is appropriate to think of this as being a very complex recovery. So unfortunately, the recoveries of the past, which were fairly quick, 9/11, SARS, even the economic downturn, numbers have shown that Asia generally recovers much quicker. After the economic downturn, it took us 3 years in North America, I believe I have that number correctly, to get back to the pre-2008 numbers. I think that we're talking here not a matter of months, but we're talking a matter of at least at least a year and a bit.
Okay, sounds good. And the last question that we have for today, because time is up, will low-cost carriers be able to cope with this situation, considering their low-cost strategy? And if I can comment on that one initially, I would say potentially the low costs are the ones that, they are the ones that have the lowest cost structure. They have the lowest cost per available seat kilometers per mile. So hopefully they have instituted already a very very low number of employees per aircraft plus some other measures, and they hopefully will be able to cope better than the full network carriers.
Can I just add to that?
Yes.
Yeah, Renee, Charlie, I just want to add to that. I mean, I think you're right. Proportionally, they're not going to be able to perhaps grind out as much incremental cost that a full service carrier could do at this point in time. But I think that on the flip side of this, their cost structure and their pricing strategies are probably going to put them in a much better position coming out into a recovery as well. So demand, I think that the stickiness of a low cost carrier is going to be that much higher, I would think, at a time coming out of an economic downturn. And that's just kind of simple thinking on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, the time is up. I want to thank you, Aviation Festival Americas, for putting this together, our experts in the panel. Thank you very much. And as well to you, to the audience, for joining. As a follow-up actions, an audio transcript of this webinar and a takeaway of this conversation will be available in social media or even sent to you directly to your inbox. It has been an absolute pleasure to moderate this conversation, be part of this panel. I thank you enough. Please stay healthy and safe, and thank you for the opportunity. Have a good day.
Enjoyed it as well.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all.